Hi, this is Johnny. I'm going to be going over CalTPA. This is Step 2, Teach and Assess. This is coming from the Performance Assessment Guide from the fall of 2019. So let's get started. Teach and Assess. You're going to conduct the learning segment including informal and student self-assessments. All right, so let's focus on the first piece here. During the learning segment, you will use informal assessments to periodically and strategically check on student understanding. So I always call this checks for understanding. Check on student understanding or the ability to demonstrate the content-specific and, if appropriate, ELD learning goals and academic language you are teaching, allowing you to, and here's the big word, adjust your instruction in the moment to meet your students' learning needs. So in this particular frame, they're saying informal assessment should be about ELD learning and academic language learning. All right, so you need to make sure those two things happen. Don't bundle ELD and academic language together, though you could. There's good ways to think about that, but you want to be specific to each of them and how you're supporting kids across those two language domains. The main thing about this is the adjusting your instruction. The point of informal assessment is formative. It's a formative activity in which you're gauging and checking in with your students to see the measure of not just their learning, but the measure of, more importantly, your teaching. Based on what they show you during informal assessment, you have to make adjustments to say, well, maybe I need to move on, maybe I need to revisit, maybe I need to amplify, maybe I need to model again, maybe I need to ask a different question. All the different things you might do in the middle of your teaching, in the moment, to make what you're trying to teach available and understandable, comprehensible to your students. So the point of informal assessment is formative, forming your teaching in a way that makes it better for your students. Okay, so hold on to that. Now, the reciprocal part is the student self-assessment. So, in addition, you will use student self-assessment to learn about how individual students understand what they know or can demonstrate about the content-specific and, if appropriate, again, ELD learning goals and academic language, and determine what they need to do next to continue their learning with your support. So there's a couple of funny things here to hold on to. In the way that CalTPA is framing this, student self-assessment, their reporting of their own learning, a kind of metacognitive activity, helps you to see how they see themselves as learners. But more importantly, and this is the part that's missing here, is the students get to see themselves as learners, and this part about determine what they need to do next. This is also for the students to determine for themselves what to do next. So hold on, if you really want to do self-assessment right, that's the thing that should be emphasized here, all right? You're having your students do self-assessment for your way, your vision into, your window into how they're thinking and how they're doing. But remember, essentially, it's for themselves. It's the window they make for themselves to understand how they're doing by their learning. All right? The next piece, and this is the third piece of the triumvirate on this one, which is feedback. Okay, so let's make sure we have all three. Informal assessment, student self-assessment, and feedback. And we're going to talk about each of those. All right? Provide your specific feedback to your students as they engage in the assessments. All right? Now, this piece is going to be new. It's not a familiar activity for most folks. Students need to be taught how to conduct self-assessment using a rubric with clear scoring criteria at each level. All right? So this means that you're going to be using some kind of tool at some point, or more than one point, where kids are going to be marking themselves or describing their own learning based on criteria that have been set out. As I said before, use the rubrics that you've been using all along the way. Use those as the frame. So let's go ahead and go through my notes for student self-assessment. Okay. The first thing is vary the use of informal assessment. All right? So this means do frequent in-the-moment checks. So that's one thing. In-the-moment checks. You're walking around the room, you're looking over shoulders, you're asking a quick question to one or two kids. Those are in-the-moment checks. You're doing polling, which means you have kids thumbs up, how are you doing? Fist to 5. 5, I'm doing great. 4, I could get a little help from my friends and I'll be fine. 3, I needed some help from you. Okay. You could be checking through discussion or by questioning, having a discussion and questions within the discussion, or just asking a few questions of kids around the way. These are all just taking the pulse, seeing what's going on, all with the intent of taking whatever's given and moving your instruction, changing your instruction, adjusting your instruction to make it better for your students' learning. All right? The other thing I wrote here is do also, aside from those in-the-moment checks, polling, discussion, and question, these are more formal, and this is where you might attach your rubric. So this is probably the place where you need to think about where the rubric goes. Okay. Exit tickets. Okay. Collect ongoing math or writing assignments. So you can imagine, especially in writing, if they're doing drafts of things that they might use, they might have a rubric alongside each of their points along their writing cycle, you know, drafts along the way. You might have some kind of rubric for math where it focuses not just singularly on the solution, but on representation. Did you show your ideas? Did you communicate how you were thinking? Did you double check your approaches? Those things might be included within some kind of rubric for math, for self-check, for self-assessment. Okay. The next piece is you want to, let me back up a little bit. So this whole thing about exit tickets, collecting ongoing writing, math or writing assignments, the point is to tell you what to do in your teaching in following lessons, okay? And the big idea, as I've been trying to share, informal assessment informs you, tells you how to better teach your students, all right? And in this regard, student self-assessment, your take on how students are self-assessing themselves is also informing your instruction. Let's go back down here then. You want to emphasize how informal assessment moves you to adjust your teaching for your students. So in your reporting, it's not just, here I did an informal check for understanding and they told me this. Or, you know, I did an exit ticket and they told me this. So what matters is, I did an informal check for understanding, they told me these things, and then I did this in my teaching in response. That's the big important thing. I gave my students as an exit ticket at the end of the lesson, and based on the results of the exit ticket, what they told me in the exit ticket, the next day I chose to make my instruction or change my instruction or adjust my instruction to do this. That's the part you want to emphasize. How did the informal check, how did student self-assessment move you in your teaching? All right. Next piece is just to be smart. Have students use your rubrics. Okay. Don't make separate rubrics. Just make the rubrics work for your kids, working from the same set of success criteria that you set out in your planning. Be smart. Have your students use your rubrics to self-assess as part of exit tickets in class assignments. Now you could imagine setting out exit tickets where the first part of the exit ticket, the first 1 or 2 questions, is all about content knowledge, but the last question could be a self-assessment. Okay, and the self-assessment question could be, what things I think I could have done better by, okay, or it could be ways in which I worked that helped me be a better learner or be successful, or things I think I need to work on a bit better so I can learn more from this. So you can imagine that last piece, you know, there's 4 questions in the exit ticket, the last question is a self-assessment. Those are the kinds of places you can put self-assessment in usefully. Right? And now feedback. Feedback through talking questions should happen throughout your teaching. So don't think of it as singular and formal. Don't think about it as like, I will write some notes on their assignment. I will write some things on their written draft, and that will be my feedback. You're giving feedback all the time in your teaching just by the kinds of words you say, the little bit of direction you give here or there, the question that you might ask a student that makes them think a little bit differently or question the way they're working. All of those things are feedback, so make sure all of those things are happening, just like informal assessments happening all the time. In this case, though, you will want to document it. And as I've said before, anticipate what kinds of feedback you want to give students that you can collect and demonstrate for CalTPA. So anticipate having an assignment where you're giving written feedback to your students, and that will be an artifact for CalTPA to see the kinds of feedback that you give. All right? So that goes with the last one. You should give written feedback on in-class assignments. So find some piece somewhere where you're giving written feedback. Otherwise, you'll have to collect the feedback, or maybe you should be collecting the feedback in video. Now remember, within the videos, you might capture times when you're giving oral feedback to students and telling them things that help them move along in their learning. You just have to anticipate where are you collecting artifacts on the video or in paper and writing that will matter. Okay? So that's all about the first part. That's the conduct the learning segment, including informal and student self-assessments. Let's go to the next part, select and annotate video clips. Now these are very specific, and there's going to be four video clips, and we'll go through each one of them in turn, all right? And as I said earlier, record everything. Let's go ahead and start with video clip 1. In video clip 1, we want to, you should be showing how students engage with content to develop, and here's the essential thing, develop the vocabulary, terminology, academic language necessary for the language demands of the lesson. Okay? So the video clip can be up to 5 minutes. This is not the only thing that might happen in that video clip. You want to show lots of your good teaching. You also, within this particular video clip, even though it says focus on vocabulary, terminology, academic language development, these are places where you might have an informal check for understanding. This might be a place where you have students self-assess. All of those things should be happening too. So even though they give a very particular set of requirements for each of the video clips, remember all the other things about informal assessment, self-assessment, formal assessment, checks for understanding, feedback, all of those things should be happening alongside as a natural part, expected part of your everyday teaching. But on this first one, make sure that it's about language. So I wrote this here. Video clip is all about language. How are you setting up students to understand the language involved in the lesson? How are students using that language? So there's 2 ways to do this. You could be intentional, okay? And you should be intentional. If you're just going through definitions for vocabulary words, that probably not sufficient. You want to find some ways in which you demonstrate them in context. The way that language is developed is very, very contextual, so you want to be making sure, especially if they're, particular words in math or particular words about writing or literacy, how are they involved in the activity that's involved in that subject? Not just as a separate lesson, here are some words in math that we need to know. Okay? You want to show how you use them in context as you're doing math, or as you are reading, or as you are writing. And then it would be good for you to have kids also demonstrate their use of that terminology or that kind of language in the activity expected, whether it's math or literacy. All right, so that's video clip 1. So I've said 2 things. The first one is how are you setting up students to understand the language? The other ones are how are students using that language? Try to do both. Clip 2, video clip 2, students' use of educational technology. Select a clip from the learning segment that shows 1 or more students using educational technology to engage in or demonstrate their content-specific learning. Now, this clip is probably the easiest one to do because you just have to show kids using something that's in relation to the learning goals. Now, I'm going to let you know we haven't gotten to the next page yet. Clip 3 asks a ton. So if you wanted to have a clip where you get at informal feedback, all those kinds of things. It's going to be expected in the next clips, but you can also make sure that that happens here. So imagine your kids are using some kind of Chromebooks or educational technology, and along the way you're checking for understanding and you're giving feedback as they're using that technology. Then you're doing two things with one video. So be smart about things like that, all right? So video clip 2 is about technology use. At least one student needs to be using technology and activity related to your learning goals. And it says that. So you're going to have to think about how you want to manage that. All right? And this segment might be you sitting with a small group or sitting with a few kids who are using the educational technology. This might be the video where you don't have to have many students involved. You can imagine within the learning segment, you're sitting with 1 or 2 kids as they're going through some kind of activities on the technology, and you can imagine asking them questions where they self-assess their use and their work on using the educational technology. Again, you get 2 for 1, so be smart about that. All right, I'm going to go to the next page so we can see about the other video clips. Okay, video clip 3. This one is the one that's asking a lot. So be ready for this one, all right? Instruction and informal assessment of content. This is the painful part. No more than 5 minutes. Don't ask me why. Select a clip from your learning segment that includes informal assessment. So let's go ahead and mark all the things in here. Informal assessment of students' learning. Okay. Show how you provide opportunities for students to engage in deep learning of the content to develop their higher order thinking skills. That's another thing. Show how you provide feedback to individuals, groups, or the whole class in the moment, and then how you adjusted your instruction. Okay? So if we look over here, you can see I've written out all the pieces for this one. Right? First off, you must show informal assessment, okay? Checks for understanding, and it says you could be working with, you could do more than one. It might be a couple different checks for understanding. It might be some kind of polling. It might be some kind of little quiz or something like that, whatever. It could be more than one thing, but you must show in this clip, within that 5 minutes, some kind of informal assessment. The second one is show students engaged in higher order thinking. Okay. Now here's a twofer for you, all right? A way to think about this one is your informal assessment could be working from one of your essential questions. So to check for students' understanding in an informal way, you might ask a very rich question. Okay? So at that point, in that manner, you're both doing an informal check for understanding and you're moving kids to engage in higher order thinking. The rich question does 2 things. Informal assessment of where they are and how they're thinking, and then you can see that kids are engaged in higher order thinking. Following that, if you're smart, you might find a way to give them feedback on their responses, all right? Okay. And this one you'll have to figure out depending on what's going on. This last one is you don't know, you can't anticipate this one, but you must be willing to take up whatever the students have given you and make some kind of response to them in your teaching, all right? Must show you adjusting your instruction in response to your check for understanding and interaction with students, all right? So I'll give you a way to think about this using the frame that I was offering earlier. Your informal check for understanding, your informal assessment has some kind of rich questions. Those questions themselves engage students in higher order thinking. Their responses to those questions allow you to give them feedback. Based on that feedback and based on what they've given you before, you might make a turn in your teaching to go deeper or go in a different direction based on their responses, right? So this one, video clip 3, is the hardest one. It asks a lot. Trying to do 2 or 3 things at once might be the smartest thing to do. All right. I'm going to go to video clip 4. And video clip 4. Okay. Instruction and self-assessment of content. Again, no more than 5 minutes. Select a clip of at least one student. Okay, you see that? That's what they say, at least one. That means there can be one. Using self-assessment to demonstrate their understanding of content specific and if appropriate. This and if means if you can. Whenever they say and if, you want to try to do that, okay, because it's better. And if appropriate, ELD learning goals and how you provided feedback, okay, to the student based on their self-assessment results. All right. So if we go down here, video clip 4 is all about self-assessment. There are two things you have to do. You have to show students doing self-assessment, and then you have to show you giving feedback based on that self-assessment. So just make sure both of those things are happening. Okay, so with the prior video clips and this one as well, when you go through a video clip, use this as a kind of checklist. Okay, so video clip 3 must. Okay, video clip 4 must. Do a check for yourself. All right. Okay. And there's some explanatory things coming up here next in the next box, which is important notes. Okay. Video clips can be selected from the video recording of the complete learning segment, 3 to 5 lessons. However, each clip must be unedited and continuous. All right. You don't have a 5-minute video where you break in the middle and switch to a different view or whatever. It has to be Steadicam. It can't be any cuts at all. All right. And provide uninterrupted instruction. That also means you don't want to have it where you have the video going and then you're teaching, and then you've got to do the Pledge of Allegiance and then you come back to your teaching. It should all be about the learning that was intended in your planning. Video clips should not be edited to include added music, graphics, or other elements. I don't know who would do that, but now you know. All right. You may use no more than 5 minutes for each clip to demonstrate your ability to address the teaching practices required through the annotation titles. Now we're going to go through annotations in a minute. Those are probably equally important as your selection, so you want to take good care to select worthwhile video clips. The annotations, we'll talk about in a moment, are the way you justify those choices in your teaching. Okay. Please note that the length of your video is not the focus of the assessment. Okay. You can do some things, especially for younger students, in less than 5 minutes. All right. And then if you make the video longer, the assessor will only watch the first 5 minutes. All right. Okay. And this is one that some folks miss sometimes. Candidates and students must be visible in the video recordings. I don't think that means you can't be out of frame for a few seconds or a moment, but it has to be clear where you are and what you're doing. You don't want half the video to be on you and half the video to be on the kids. The best thing is to find a peer, another student teacher if you can, or somebody in the building, or your cooperating teacher who essentially follows you around with your camera. And this, most likely, most of you will use your phone camera. Just make sure that you are present in the frames and make sure that it's clear what the kids are doing all the time. It's best if it's try not to do a video where you're teaching at the board and all the instruction is clearly you and all you see of the kids is the back of their heads. Do have somebody move around to the side if you're doing floor work. Do it at an angle where you can see students' faces, because you want to be able to hear and see and hear them and see their responses. So make sure that the video is not just about you, it's about you and what's happening with your kids because of your teaching. That's the essential thing about the videos. All right? Okay. So let's see what I have here. A couple more notes. First up here, clips must be continuous and only 5 minutes. This is probably way more important, so let's make this more important. Be strategic. Organize your teaching so that segments of lessons will meet the specific criteria for each video clip requirement. Don't just hope that the clip criteria will happen to show up in your lesson. Make it happen. So you can imagine the day of the lesson, you're looking at your notes, and at the top of it you say, Today I'm going to be doing this kind of teaching. I'm going to make sure that I do informal check for understanding here. I will make sure that after that I will follow with some kind of feedback for my students. I will ask these questions today in order to get at higher order thinking. Okay, so be strategic. Don't let it go to chance. Remember, you only have your video and your annotations as ways to justify your good teaching. So you want to set yourself up so you can get the most out of it. So I would say before every day when you teach your learning segment, you set out and say, I want to have these 3 things show up in my video. So I better make sure they're part of my teaching. Okay. Next piece, and we're going to get to that on the next page, which is you will enter annotations for your videos in the submission interface, and you've probably done that for CalTPA 1. All right, so let's go look at what those are. All right, so these are the annotation titles. I'm going to talk about each one of these. All right, the first thing you must understand is, and be smart about this too, which is these annotation titles can cut across your videos. So there's 4 of them. You have 4 video clips. You can have any one of these be in any number of your, can be used as annotations for any number of your video clips. So if you can imagine seeing any one of these 3 or 4 times, then you're probably going to be in a stronger place than if you show it just once in one video clip. The flip side of that is don't annotate things that don't really correspond well to these annotations, all right? So let's get started. The first one, assessing student learning and development of academic language. Okay, so they're very clear this is what they care about. All right. Explain why students are engaged in specific learning activities focused on developing academic language to learn the content. All right. All right. So what I wrote here, assessing student learning and development of academic language. Remember, there is an and here. Okay. You want to use this annotation everywhere everywhere you address academic language. Make sure that you use this annotation both when language is the focus of instruction, okay, and when language is the focus of assessment. So this is the and, all right? So make sure you understand that there's 2 parts here. This is the assessing and the development, all right? So how are you checking to see that they're developing that academic language, and how are they using that kind of language in context? So 2 things, remember? So the and matters a whole bunch here. Both the language is the focus of instruction, and when the language is the focus of the assessment. So you can imagine in the annotations, you can say, here academic language is the focus of instruction, da-da-da-da-da. Here, in my informal check for understanding, academic language is the focus of the assessment. All right, so make sure you do both. Let's go to the next one. Students using educational technology. Provide a rationale for how students' use of educational technology supports or demonstrates their content-specific learning. So that means that whatever they're doing with educational technology needs to be particular to what you're trying to teach them, not ancillary. All right? Let's see, what did I write? I wrote educational technology. Mark everywhere students are using technology as part of their learning. You must say why this use matters to what they are supposed to learn. Okay, that should sum it up. Okay, the next one's pretty straightforward too. The one after that's a problem, but we'll get to that. Providing content-specific feedback to students. Explain why you provided detailed content-specific feedback about informal and self-assessment results to the whole class, groups, or individual students, and here's an and how the feedback was intended to support students to advance their learning. Okay, so you've got the 2 words in here, why you provided it, and how the feedback was supposed to support students. Okay, so make sure you have both of those. Let's think about this together. Feedback. Every time you make a suggestion or ask a question of a student that makes them reflect on their work or thinking, mark it as this one. Okay, so all the incidental things. So it doesn't have to be that you're giving some intentional feedback right now at this moment. It could be just in the middle of any kind of lesson where you stop and you say something to some child that helps them move further in their learning. That's worthwhile feedback. Okay? So that's informal kinds of feedback, just the kind of everyday feedback. But you also want to keep in mind, and this helps you with your write-up, intentional places where you anticipate giving feedback. So this might be what you might give them on exit tickets. They give you an exit ticket one day, you write a little note on the exit ticket, you give it back to them the next day. It's a kind of feedback. You could have polls. You have the students all polled and they tell you, half of them tell you that it's something that is not quite clear to you. It's like, we just went through this math lesson right here. Are there any questions? Tell me what's going on with this. I see that 4 of you need help with this. Well, here's a way of going about it. Okay, that might be some in the moment kind of thing. Quizzes. Okay, so any places where you can intentionally give feedback, exit tickets, polls, quizzes, and give direction feedback from these. So you want to mark these 2 with the annotation, all right? So feedback, 2 parts. Every day in the moment feedback. Second, feedback you plan to give as the result of a quiz, an exit ticket, a written response, places where you will give written feedback. Now remember, feedback can be both oral and written, so make sure you understand and anticipate where you might do either of those, all right? So the next one, assessing student learning and use of higher order thinking skills. I'm going to confess I have a little trouble with this one. Maybe it's just that I'm not reading it well, but let's take a look at it. Explain why you implemented specific assessment strategies that provide students opportunities to engage in the use of higher order thinking skills. So using assessment to engage them is the part I think I'm having trouble with here. Okay, so to learn about the content and how you adjusted your instruction based on the results. For example, you may want to reteach a learning goal or advance forward beyond the set goal depending on the results of informal assessments of student learning as you move them through the learning segment. This last piece doesn't go back to higher order thinking skills. Like I said, I have some trouble with this one. My take on it, and you should ask other folks if you're not quite clear on it. I wrote assessing student learning and use of higher order thinking skills. I wrote this one is poorly written. And if you look at how long the first sentence is and all the different things it tries to do, maybe you might agree. Here's my best sense. Annotate the moments where you made some adjustment to your teaching based on what your assessment told you. Okay? Explain what the assessment told you about your students' understanding and how this led you to making an adjustment in your teaching. All right? Now what you want to do, and this is just me realizing it in the moment, you want to annotate moments when it was about higher order thinking. Okay? As I suggested before, you might think about doing some kind of assessment where your informal assessment, asks kids to reach for deeper thinking through some kind of really worthwhile essential questions. And then your response to what they offer you is how you adjust your instruction or make some kinds of changes. All right? So I find this one a little convoluted. Do your best. The main thing is you're engaging kids in rich questions. Their responses to your rich questions or rich activity is a form of assessment, and that kind of assessment makes you move your teaching in one direction or another in some kind of adjustment. I hope that helps. Okay. Let's go to the bones here. The next things that they set out here. Each annotation must be used at least once across the 4 video clips. If appropriate, you may use annotation titles multiple times. That's not just appropriate, it's probably smart. So be smart about it. Okay. Be sure that your annotation title and rationale explain the timestamp segment you have selected. So you want those things to be in line, right? Okay. You want to have the right annotation for the right segment. All right. The next piece, when you upload your annotated video clips for submission, you'll be required to assign a label to each file indicating whether it is Clip 1, Instruction and Assessment of Academic Language Development, Clip 2, Students' Use of Educational Technology, Clip 3, Instruction and Informal Assessment, or Clip 4, Instruction and Student Self-Assessment. Be sure that you appropriately label each video clip up during the upload process. And you should be able to handle all of those good things. Let's take a look at the next page. Okay. And this third part is the analysis of informal and student self-assessments. All right. So I'm going to go through each one of these. Respond to the following prompts to describe your analysis of the assessments using the template provided. Okay. So they've asked you to do 3 kinds of assessment. They've asked you to do informal assessment, student self-assessment, and formal assessment. Okay, you've done that. Now, what good sense do you make of it? And that's what you have to do in this piece. All right? So I'm going to go through each one of them. Number 1, how did your informal assessment results to learn about how did you use informal assessment results to learn about and support students' academic language development? How did you adjust your instruction based on these results? Okay, so there's 2 parts here. First one is informal assessment, and this is all about academic language. Okay, what did this help you? What did this do to help you to better understand students' subject matter academic language development? So make sure it's all about this thing, academic language development. And then again, this word comes up again and again. What did you do based on what you learned about your kids in academic language development? All right. Number 2, how did your in-the-moment informal assessments and student self-assessment give you the opportunity to provide feedback to students about how to improve or revise their work, and to help them to understand what they need to do next to continue progress toward or beyond meeting the learning goals? Okay, how did you adjust your instruction to meet these based on these results? There are a couple things in this one. Okay, there's an and statement here, so be careful of that one. So you're going to help students, provide feedback to students about how to improve or revise their work, and to help them understand, this is the part where you give back to them what they need to do to continue to progress toward or beyond the meeting the learning goals. Okay, so this is 2 parts. One is you want to make sure that it's about the particular work. So what is it in that work that they need to do better? And the second part is, what do they need to be paying attention to in regards to the overall learning goals? Okay, that's a bit of an ask. Try to do both, but the next piece is, how did you adjust your learning instruction based on the results? What I have over here, how did your informal assessment set you up to give feedback? Okay, and then the other part is, what did your student self-assessment, how did your student self-assessment set you up to give feedback? So both of them, informal to feedback. Okay, so informal set you up for feedback, and then the other one is student self-assessment. So how did your student self-assessment set you up to give feedback? Okay, so we've got the informal assessment for feedback, and we've got student self-assessment to set up feedback. So keeping those things in mind. Okay, and then the important word, which comes up again and again and again. In each case, how did you adjust your instruction based on the informal and self-assessments? All right, always thinking about the whole point of doing those assessments is to make something better. Right? Informal and self-assessment is all about formative. Make something better based on what you learned from them. Right, so let's take a look at the third one now. How did student self-assessment results provide insight about students' own understanding of the content-specific and, if appropriate, ELD learning goals and their progress toward meeting the goals? How did you adjust your instruction based on these results? This time the focus is on the student self-assessment. Okay. And what you need to do on this one is focus on the learning goals here. How did your students describe their own understanding in relationship to the learning goals? What did you learn from this? So this is about your interpreting what kids got from their own self-assessment of their learning progress towards the learning goals. And again, how did you adjust your teaching as a result? All right. So if we wanted to characterize it a little bit more plainly, maybe, number 2 is about what you're doing with the assessments, the informal and the student self-assessment. And then number 3 is about what you gained from student self-assessment for your teaching. Okay, so let's remember that both of these are around informal and student self-assessment. Okay, and the next page takes us to step 3, which is reflect, and that will be a different video. I hope you found this useful. Yeah.